Hello, Chris here, back for another video. Thanks for joining to hear me yap a little bit more about some cinematography stuff. Now, there are a lot of videos on here explaining the basics of ISO and how to understand the exposure triangle in relation to getting a properly exposed image. What I want to talk about today is actually a bit more in depth than the basics. So if you're ready to nerd out about the intricacies of ISO, dynamic range, and intricate ways of getting the most out of your camera sensor, then sit back and relax. So today we're going to talk about ISO and how it affects your camera's distribution of your dynamic range. We're going to talk about how we monitor exposure on set and the benefits and drawbacks of systems such as false color and the EL zone system and how those compare with actually using your light meter. Spoiler alert, they do not replace a light meter, and we're just going to look at some test footage and discuss practical use cases for what we find out about that. I just want to note before we get started that the point of this isn't to just get as clean an image as possible. It's only to test our cameras to know how best we can get different looks in different situations. Overall, the info is based on just my experience and research I've done, but I'm not the last word on any of this stuff, so if you see something that I could express in a more accurate way, please let me know. Okay, with all that being said, let's dive in. So starting out, let's talk about ISO. Starting all the way from the beginning, ISO stands for the International Organization for Standards. It's a standardized number that represents a camera's sensitivity to light, carried over from the film days where it was known as ASA. So if you want to be extra, you can say ASA instead of ISO and everyone will think, oh, you're a nerd. But yeah, anyways, ASA stands for the American Standards Association, and it was the number on the box of film that would measure the speed. Ever wonder why it's called speed, by the way? Basically, in the early days of photography, most of the stocks had very low sensitivities to light, and they needed longer shutter times to get proper exposure. So those stocks were known as slow. And the more sensitive stocks were known as fast because you could get faster shutter speeds if they needed to be exposed to light for less amounts of time. I think that this is the same logic to why lenses are referred to as fast, in that when you have a fast lens, i.e. one with a wide aperture like 1.4, then you're able to use a faster shutter speed to get your photo exposed where you want it to be. And yeah, I think there's a whole rant I could go on in terms of how we should change how we think of the exposure triangle when using digital cameras, but I will save that for later in the video, which you'll see why. But anyway, so the thing about ISO in digital cameras nowadays is that it affects how your camera sets its noise floor and what it considers to be middle gray. When you adjust your ISO, you're not actually changing how much light is hitting your sensor, but rather you're just changing how your camera interprets the light that's hitting the sensor. Basically, how much the signal from your sensor is amplified or unamplified electronically. So generally, you'll hear people talk about how a camera's native ISO is where you'll get the best image or most dynamic range, and this is fine for most people, but it's really not telling you the whole story, I don't think. And I really have benefited from looking deeper into how it works. So in digital cameras, it's true that you do lose some of your sensor's total range as you stray away from the camera's native ISO, and that amount will vary from camera to camera, so you'll have to test with your specific model to see that effect. But what I think is more important to note is that in adjusting your ISO, it actually has an effect on the distribution of your sensor's dynamic range. In addition to where you're telling the camera to place middle gray. So for the most part, all that the base ISO is the manufacturer's recommendation for where you'll get the most even balance between where the noise floor sits, the stops above middle gray, and the stops below middle gray that your camera is able to capture. A good starting point, basically, and one that they've shown to be true in like a lab. But once you start to think about how this works in relation to your specific shooting scenario, there's a lot of creative power to be gained, and you can really use your camera to its fullest potential by knowing more. Even in just looking at online the dynamic range test of cameras, often they'll only show tests done at 800 ISO, considering it to be where you're getting the most dynamic range or like the best performance. But that really only tells you part of the story, and oftentimes it's not showing you the camera's full potential. I will say this topic in particular is a massive and confusing bag of worms that I spent several weeks researching. The reason for this confusion is because every camera manufacturer handles ISO a little bit differently. I'm not gonna get too much into the weeds of how the ISO processing works because A, I'm not a camera engineer and I don't feel qualified to discuss that based on the research that I've done. And B, the one thing that I find to be true about all of this stuff is that how the camera processes its data and what can be considered like native ISO is so manufacturer specific. So I'm not gonna get super into the weeds on that for those reasons. I really think that you as a cinematographer should be testing each new tool for yourself to identify how best to use it for your storytelling. So this is just me showing my process for how I test latitude and exposure on cameras that I'm working with. So to start, let's talk about the effects of ISO on your dynamic range in cinema cameras. So generally speaking, and we're not talking about RAW just yet, adjusting your ISO down will effectively lower your noise floor. And in doing this, you lower the threshold of where you start to see noticeable noise in your image. So if you're shooting a dark scene at an ISO of say 100, your camera will have a lower noise floor than it would if you were shooting at ISO 800, and so on and so forth. So if you're shooting a scene and you expose for a low ISO, the benefit of this, or rather I'll say the effect, because the benefit versus drawback depends on your use case, the effect is that you have an image with less noise in its darker areas compared to if you were looking at the shadow areas of a scene shot at a higher ISO. And when we test this, we want to just make sure that the areas we're comparing are the same amount of stops under middle gray or over middle gray. Now conversely, when you increase your ISO, you raise your noise floor, and the result is that you have a situation where you're comparing exposing for lower ISO versus exposing higher ISO. Your image will appear noisier in the shadows, and this is because the noise floor of your sensor is now closer to the dark areas of your frame. Simple enough, but there is a catch. On many cameras, when you set your ISO lower, in lowering your noise floor, you're also going to lower where it clips as well, or the distance between middle gray of your sensor and where it's going to clip your highlights. So the total distance from the noise floor to the clipping point is your sensor's dynamic range. On most cinema cameras, the total amount of range will not change all that much as you go through the ISO range, but the way that the camera sets where your middle gray is will shift up and down along that range. You can effectively think of it like when you're shooting at a low ISO, your camera is prioritizing the information in the darker areas that it's able to see. It sounds very counterintuitive, I know, but yeah. So TLDR, lower ISOs, you'll have more stops below middle gray before noise is noticeable, but also you'll have less range above middle gray between it and where your highlights are going to start to clip. So now, let's talk about increasing your ISO. It's basically vice versa with decreasing the ISO. So basically, as you increase your ISO on most cinema cameras, it's going to redistribute your range to allow you to have more stops above middle gray to the highlights. This doesn't mean that you increase your total dynamic range. Like if you're clipping at 400, then you'll be clipping at 800 if all you do is change your ISO. But if you light and expose your subject at 800, then you could have more range in the highlights than you would if you lit and exposed for a lower ISO. The distribution of this varies a lot from camera to camera, so just be sure to check your specific camera manufacturer to see if they've released a chart of your camera's range distribution. Another thing is that a lot of cameras nowadays have a dual gain system in them where they have two different signal amplifiers, and the camera will switch off to a more powerful one above a certain ISO. Effectively, it's though your camera has two sets of noise profiles, and you can definitely use this to your advantage. Usually though, there are some trade-offs for this, so of course test your specific camera for your specific use case to identify what's going to be best for your particular scene. So here's a great video going more in depth on the dual native ISO stuff. So with all that being said, the hypothesis right now, prior to testing your cameras, is that for scenes where you anticipate having a lot of elements in frame that are on the lower end of your exposure range, like below middle gray, in like night scenes, if you want to capture them with as little noise as possible, then you might consider shooting with a lower ISO because your noise floor will be lower. And for scenes where you have a lot of the elements in your frame on the higher end of your exposure range above middle gray, and you want to have more range in the highlights, you might want to shoot at a higher ISO. And for scenes with a lot of contrast where you have elements on either end, then you should consider choosing an ISO in the middle that's going to appropriately give you the range in both the shadows and the highlights to capture those effectively. And I'll note that this is just all super subjective, so oftentimes I don't want the image to be completely clean. Oftentimes I want to have that texture in order to make it feel more natural and less digital. This can also be used in considering keeping the same amount of noise in your image from scene to scene. You might think if you want to keep that same textural feel in your image, you would want to have the ISO the same for the whole show, but actually, in keeping the same amount of texture in your day scenes as your night scenes, you might be better served thinking about where you're putting the noise floor so that you keep it the same amount of distance from not only just your subject, but also the other things in the frame. Like if you're shooting a day scene at 800 and then you go and shoot a night scene at 800, the subject could look the same noise-wise, but the surrounding areas could have completely different noise characteristics. And this could be a further choice that could help you in conveying a feeling to an audience if you consider it. And yeah, again, none of this is gonna make or break your image, and there's far more important things to consider, like production design. But I just think it's cool learning how your sensor will behave in each situation. Just lets you more effectively be able to make a story-informed decision about how you want to say what you want to say with your image. So for instance, right now I'm prepping to shoot a feature, and I and the director have identified a couple camera systems that we plan to potentially shoot with. That's for budget and story reasons and given the look that we're going for. So let's say I test this camera and it feels a little bit too digital with its noise profile. Okay, so I test lighting in a way to eliminate most of that noise. And then what if it's a little too sterile without the noise? So since I know how the sensor behaves, my plan could be to shoot it clean with very little noise, and then in the color session, we can add back some texture and grain that feels right to get it right where we want it to be. Effectively, we're just taking a limitation and then using our knowledge of the sensor to identify what's going to be the best for the look and feel of the film. Just another tool in the tool belt. So it all sounds nice, but in reality, there are a lot of gray areas and variables when you're shooting, and it can be hard to manage all of this when you're in the moment. So how do you know what's going to be best for the situation that you're in when you got 2 or 3 setups to go and only a little bit more time in your day? And that leads me to our next part, which is going to be monitoring your exposure on set. So there are many ways to judge your exposure on set. An incident meter, a spot meter, false color, EL zone, an uncalibrated client monitor, etc. So they all have benefits and drawbacks. As I was doing the test in this video, I also took the opportunity to test my preferred methods for accuracy versus other methods. Now, my current most preferred method, which I would argue is a necessity for having the most accurate information about the illuminance in a space, is just, of course, I always like to have my light meter. It's like my left hand on set when I'm shooting something, and I'd be blind without it. Light meters have been around forever, but there are also so many newer systems of measuring exposure, like the EL zone system, which we'll talk about, or zebras, or false color. And while those have benefits in terms of being quick and convenient, and built into your monitor sometimes, or camera, the most accurate and foolproof method is still going to be your light meter. New technology is cool and useful, but I feel like the best thing that you can do is identify the good parts of the older standard methods as well as the good parts of the newer methods, and account for both and make informed decisions in the moment to know which is going to be the right thing that you should use. So I'm going to talk about the light meter first. And the main benefit of this is that no matter the camera, no matter the monitor, I can objectively know what the sensor is getting based on the illuminance of what's in front of it. And another benefit of using a light meter is that it can also tell you illuminance in a format independent of your camera settings, in the form of foot candles or lux. And this allows you to do a couple of things. One is to be able to communicate with your gaffer, who may have a light meter, about specific levels of light that you're going to want in a scene, regardless of him having to know what your camera settings are, which you may also change. And another way that I use foot candles is when I'm scouting a space, to be able to know the objective amount of natural light coming into that space for a certain time of day. And this is useful when I'm planning out my lighting, to be able to know what sources and modifiers I'm going to need to use to get the desired result. Now, there are 2 most common ways of metering, and both have situational benefits. The first way is an incident meter, which measures the light falling on a subject, and it'll tell you where middle gray is if you were to place a gray card under that quality of light or quantity of light. And the second way is reflective metering, which measures the light reflecting off a subject, and this is going to be the way to identify what the reflective luminance of things in your frame specifically are. And it's the same light that goes into your camera's lens and that you film. So those are the basic definitions of these different types of metering, but how do you use them? Well, my particular way of thinking about these things is that I like to think of an incident meter as being kind of a more objective measure of light in a space, and reflective or spot meter as being more subjective. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. I say incident is objective because it's going to tell me the amount of light that's falling on my subject, but not how that subject in particular is going to look to my camera in relation to that amount of light falling on them. So, for instance, I can know that I have around 50 foot candles of light falling onto my skin right now, giving us a middle gray of, say, 5.6 at 800 ISO. But that doesn't tell me much how much of that light is going to bounce off my particular dark skin tone and enter my camera's lens. So if I'm wearing a bright pink shirt, it doesn't tell me how bright that's going to be. And I came to understand this because I shoot a lot of corporate work and interviews, and I always have a lot of different skin tones that I'm filming, a full gradient, and I'm wanting to expose for them consistently from one to the other. And the conventional way of thinking of dark skin sits a half stop under, and light skin sits like a half stop over middle grade, it didn't really help me in getting results that I was happy with. So I got a light meter with a spot meter because that would allow me to get more specific to the subjective way that the things my camera sees would be rendered. And that extends to other things as well, like say the objects or features in the background in the scene. Maybe you want to have parts of the background be consistently a few stops under or consistently a few stops over your talent and your key. You can use an incident meter for that too. It's just about knowing and choosing when you want to expose things in particular ways and how much control you have over those things in frame. Now, in the ASC manual, it actually talks about how spot metering is a particularly popular thing with Ansel Adams zone system enjoyers, and that also ties into our next bit of discussion, which is the EL, or exposure latitude zone system, which is based on the Ansel Adams zone system. And this was invented by Ed Lockman ASC, and it basically splits up your exposure range into 14 zones and labels each of them by the amount of stops above or under your camera's middle grade that they lie. The EL zone system is good for a couple of reasons. Reason one is that once you set it up in your monitor, it can allow you to visually spot meter directly what your camera's sensor is seeing, and you'll see everything in your frame where it's going to be sitting exposure-wise. And this allows you to quickly and conveniently monitor your exposure in a much more intuitive way than other systems. Another benefit of it is that unlike false color, it is one standardized system that is translatable from camera to camera and monitor to monitor. And this, combined with how it tells you specific stops that your camera is receiving, makes it extremely useful in regards to being consistent from scene to scene and camera to camera.
Hello, Editing Chris here. I just wanted to point out one major thing that is super good about EL Zone System that I don't necessarily touch on is the fact that since it is pulling the exposure information directly off of your sensor, it's really good for being able to immediately and quickly know what certain filters are doing to different things in your scene. Like say you're using a polarizer, for instance, it's almost impossible to know exactly what it's doing in terms of your exposure with traditional methods like a light meter, given how the polarizer works with the angles and whatnot. The same goes for if you're using like a special filter or something and you don't necessarily know how much light it's cutting out. This allows you to just immediately straight off of your sensor see what that's going to be doing, which is super useful.
And especially in cases where you want to come back and you want to light a scene the same way that you did previously, much like a light meter. But it is not a light meter, and it requires you to set it up properly, and I would say that you should still test it against a light meter to confirm that it's working properly. I've been testing it over the past year or so, and it's been really great for me, and I can highly recommend it. But there is something I kind of wonder about, and that is how it handles situations increasingly more common nowadays where you have like more range above middle gray than the 6 stops that it displays. What I wondered prior to the research that I did as part of this video was if it would just squeeze your camera's range into what can be displayed on the 6 stops that it's able to show. If we're talking specifically about the Ansel Adams zone system, on the other hand, I don't think that the actual number of stops matter really, since it's just showing you where you're going to clip. So basically, I just mean instead of saying, hey, this is exactly 2 stops over. So after testing and after reading up on other people's experience with it, such as in this write-up on NewsShooter by Matthew Allard, where he tries the EL zone system on, I think, an Alexa 35, and it shows the limitation as the camera has over 6 stops more range than is displayed if he looks at the EL zone. So it seems to me that in my testing, that if you're working with a camera with around 14 stops of range, it's going to be pretty stop accurate out of the box. But if you have more than that, you may have to keep in mind that it's only going to be accurate up to around 5 stops or so. Then you could have more range than it's displaying. So as I was looking at all of this, I found in the comments too that someone mentioned that they had made a DCTL for Resolve that could actually potentially be turned into a monitor LUT to overcome this limited exposure stops issue. And I'll link that as well. Regarding the EL Zone system overall, it's a great system and I highly recommend it to anyone who's able to use it. But as with everything, it's best to test it out and know its benefits and drawbacks instead of just taking it on blind faith. Limoncello LaCroix is where it's at. Next we have false color, which is great for seeing on your camera where its middle gray is going to be sitting, as well as where it considers to be clipping. But the issue with it is that there's no universal implementation of it, and this is because of how it works, which is just by taking the signal coming off of your sensor, reading that, and based on where your specific camera's middle gray is for that sensor, it'll display where you're going to be clipping. And that's going to be different from camera to camera. Even your monitor oftentimes won't line up with what your camera tells you about where you're clipping. Honestly, provided that you test it out on your specific camera and you know how much of what it's telling you you can trust, I think it's fine. I think it's fine most of the time, especially if you're moving fast or if you don't have a meter with you. It's just important to understand its limitations, like with anything. Now that we've discussed the different ways of measuring exposure, let's get into the fun part: how to test and look at the effects of over and under exposure on your camera sensor. Now, there are many different ways of doing this, but I'm going to be basing my tests on the methods outlined in the ASC Manual 11th edition. So let's look at that. So we are going to set up our test here. I have my lovely assistant, Jason, helping out. What you're going to want to do is card. So you've got your gray card put there and you've got your talent here. Hey, editing Chris here. I'm actually going to voice this over because I feel like I didn't do a great job of explaining it. So basically, as you're preparing for this test, just make sure that in general with all of this stuff, you want to test under the same conditions that you're going to be shooting with. Make sure that your camera body is the same camera body. Make sure that the lenses that you're testing with are the same lenses that you're going to be checking. And of course, a lot of this is going to depend on what it is that you're testing for, be it exposure, how your lens performs, or other sorts of settings such as filtration and whatnot. But in general, a good way of thinking about it is just everything that you're going to do on the day, that's how you want to test it. Today, I'm just testing for exposure. Here's how this test is going to pan out. What I'm going to do is at each different ISO level, I'm going to be testing how the sensor looks when overexposed by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on stops. And then I'm also going to be testing how it handles underexposure at -1, -2, -3 stops under, and so on and so forth in that same way. So what I'm going to be doing is basically exposing for middle gray at whatever ISO I'm at. In this first case, it's going to be 800. And then I'm going to decrease my shutter angle or increase my shutter angle in order to effectively give myself decreased or increased amounts of light proportional to whatever is going to equal 1 stop, 2 stops, 3 stops, whatever. And that's where having your light meter really comes in handy, because I can just dial in those stops of shutter on my light meter and it'll tell me exactly what I need to be at. So that's how I'm conducting this test. So with that being said, let's go ahead and take a look at our results. All right, hi. So here we are in Resolve, and we are going to be taking a look at all of our lovely camera tests here. So we're just gonna, let me just show you how I generally put this together. So just like with when we were preparing to film the tests, similarly so, we want to make sure that whatever process that we're going to be expecting to be used in post to handle the footage, we want to make sure that we emulate that as closely as we can. That's why in the ASC manual, it'll actually tell you that you do this like at a post house with your whoever's going to color it for you. In this case, for these tests, I am handling everything myself. So I'm going to just show you what that looks like for me in a case where I'm going to be coloring it myself. So as you see here, first thing I've done is laid out all of my footage, and I have gone ahead and color coded it. The green here is 800 ISO. The sort of yellow and orange is the 125 ISO. And I've also made the overexposure a bit brighter of a color and then the underexposure a bit darker of a color. And then we've got over here, we've got our 1000 ISO test. So I've got 125, 1000, and 800. I'm not as concerned about things in between, primarily because I'm just trying to show you guys for this video how this looks. So with that being said, I've got everything labeled out. Now we're just going to go ahead and hop over to the color tab. Okay, so you'll see a couple of things going on over here with my nodes. So first thing I have happening is this color space transform, because I shot this footage in 6K B-RAW. First, I've got my color space transformed into DaVinci Wide Gamut and DaVinci Intermediate, which is going to be a much larger color space for me to be able to make my adjustments inside of. So I do that, and then I have my white balance, and then I have my exposure compensation, which no compensation is going to be needed because we are normal exposure at 800, but for all of the other ones, they are going to have exposure compensation applied. And then here I have color space transform number 2. And the reason that this is not the last color space transform, the reason I'm not just going right back to Rec 709 for viewing here, is because I also wanted to have the ability to look at the false color and see what the false color built into Resolve is telling me. Now, it's generally, it's fine. I'm just using this to double check myself because I know that the IRE that the particular camera that I'm using considers to be middle gray is 384. So if I hover my mouse here, you can kind of see that's right on 384. That's right where we want to be. But yeah, I just like to have the option to use the false color. And for me to be able to actually use this, I have to be in the color space that I filmed in effectively. So as we can see, it's giving me middle gray as right there on my chart there. So that's great. So when I'm not using that though, I have a color space transform right after it just to go right back to Rec 709. And yeah, so this is just basically my general sort of pipeline I've got here. So now with that being said, let's go ahead and, okay. So with that being said, let's go ahead and start looking at some of this footage. So first we're going to look at 800 ISO. And let's see. So we can see here, we've gone up in brightness. We go up in brightness. We keep going. This is 3 stops over. This is 4 stops over. This is 5 stops over. 6 stops over. 6 stops over. And then 7 stops over. 7 stops over. So obviously we won't ever expose something this way. So why are we doing it this way? The reason we're doing it this way is just to see right about where our sensor is going to clip. So to make this easier, I've gone ahead and balanced it out in here as well. So I've brought my gray card right back down to middle gray at 384. And you can see I'm not quite perfectly even. It's a little slanted. So I've just exposed it for the center of the gray card. So I've gone ahead and done that with each of these with my exposure compensation here. Okay, so we can kind of start to see what happens now if we adjust our exposure in camera and then bring it down in post. We can sort of see what's going to happen here. So basically, compared to our normal exposure, when we go up and then bring down our exposure compensation, disregard the white balance difference there. So at 5 stops over, I think I'm starting to see it clip over here, and my waveform over here is confirming that. It's kind of starting to clip over here. This area is closer to the light, so that makes sense. Over here, we're still good up to 5 stops over at ISO 800. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pull up the manufacturer chart, and I'm comparing this against what they say that you have the ability to capture as I'm going. And I'm also keeping notes of what each of these look like so that I know exactly where I'm going to be clipping. Okay, so at 800, it's saying we're going to get 6.5. I'm starting to see white clip here, but middle gray is fine, so we're still good. It still makes sense. And then we're going to go to 6 stops over. We're going to balance that out. And yeah, we're kind of, things are mostly gone here. Our middle gray is okay-ish, but clearly this isn't going to be usable. And then we go over a little bit more. I think this is 7 stops over. So this is clearly, obviously, going to be past your clipping point. Now, the other reason that we've done this, beyond just seeing where exactly white is going to clip, the other reason we've done this is actually going to be to see what is the range of what's going to be usable, but also what is the range of what's going to be ideal for us. So again, you're gonna always choose how you want to do this and how you want to expose your sensor based on what you're going for with your particular project. So in this case, I'm just showing you what it's going to look like overexposed, and later I'm going to show you what it's going to look like underexposed too. But in this particular case, let's say hypothetically you were in a situation where you wanted to get a cleaner looking image. All right, so let's just go ahead and look at this noise profile here. So to do that, I'm going to just zoom in on our card here. Okay, so zooming in like this, I'm like 400% zoomed in. Let's check out our noise here. So it's present. It's not too bad. It's fine, you know. So yeah, you can see it's fine. You know, it's there, but it's not really, it's not bad. It's not a problem. It could be considered textural and desirable in many cases. So now let's see what's going to happen to that noise as we overexpose a bit. So here's 1 stop over. Here's 2 stops over. Here is 3 stops over. So with 3 stops over, we still have a little bit of range before we're going to start clipping things. But let's say hypothetically that you were to expose for 3 stops over, keeping in mind that you want to always watch whatever exposure measurement device that you have to make sure that you're not clipping. And again, this is why we do this, to make sure we know exactly where that particular sensor is going to clip. So anyways, let's take a look at how this is going to look. So we were at 400% or so. We were right about there. Let's see how this noise is going to look now. Let me go ahead and loop that. So hopefully you can see this pretty well, but that noise is a lot less prevalent. I'm going to zoom back to 396. Hopefully you can see. I'm going to make it full screen. So this image, I hope that you can see, but even just looking at it, you know, in its regular size here, it's very, very clean. The image is very clean. It's extremely clean. There is not any noise, or much less, I'll say. There's much, much less noise that's prevalent in this image. So based on that, you could remember that, okay, I like how this sensor looks when I expose for 3 stops over. And, you know, that's just another tool that you'll have in your tool belt. Alrighty, welcome back. So next, after you've identified where you like for the exposure to be sitting for different situations, what you can do is you can actually choose to intentionally do that while shooting. Of course, being careful not to clip your highlights. And this is just called exposing to the right. It's an age-old process from the film days. And you can use your light meter to help with this by setting your ISO 1 or 1.5 stops lower than your camera. Now, of course, you don't want anyone on set to see the image just looking overexposed. So what you can also do is you can create a LUT to compensate for the adjustment and load it either onto your camera, your monitor, or just whatever is going to be sending the picture to Village, so that the client, director, whoever's going to be seeing the image will just be seeing it how you intend it to be seen. I also like to go the extra step of applying the LUT onto the log image when I'm shooting RAW, just further in ensuring that the proper exposure I intend to wind up with is going to get carried through to post. So now let's talk more about the ISO and its relationship to dynamic range. Like I said before, the topic is a little bit of a rabbit hole with seemingly no clear-cut answers, and I spent a lot of time trying to understand this in a way that makes sense for most situations and for most cameras. But the only thing I can tell you for certain is that each camera is going to handle things differently, so you should always, always, always test it out and don't take anything at face value. So overall, the thing to realize is that up until the point where you're clipping, the best thing that you can do if you want a cleaner image is going to just be to give it more light, of the right quality, of course. Now, that being said, let's chat about the different ways that different cameras handle their ISO and dynamic range distribution, as well as the difference between how that's handled when you're shooting RAW and when you're not. So we already talked about earlier how changing your ISO can shift your dynamic range distribution around. So let's now talk about what this looks like in terms of when we're shooting RAW. This is actually kind of super hard for me to wrap my head around for some reason, but I finally understood this concept after browsing the cinematography.com forum and coming upon this comment by one of my all-time favorite DPs just because of how much he shares in the community, David Mullen, ASC. Here's the comment. Basically, this made sense for me when I tested for the Blackmagic, but when I was testing it with my Red, it was confusing me a bit because I thought surely it's not actually changing anything to do with my dynamic range just by me changing the ISO. I mean, it's raw. But then I realized it's not that it's actually changing anything, displaying the image to me, and that is what causes me to expose the image differently. And in exposing the image differently, that is what's affecting the distribution of my dynamic range. So here's how it works.
Think of it this way, right? When you're not shooting raw, it's like it's like you're getting a cake that is already baked. When you are shooting raw, it's like you're getting the ingredients to make that cake, right? But if I get home and I don't have apples, I can't make an apple pie. So the ISO distribution, the ISO changing, it can't really give me any information that wasn't already there on my sensor. Okay, let's look at this for instance. Let's say that you are exposed at 800 ISO for middle gray at a 5.6, and it's a bright, very bright scene, and you've got your talent that you're exposed for here at a 5.6, and then your white is going to clip 3 stops above, hypothetical. Your white's going to clip 3 stops above at a 16, and your noise floor is way down here at a 2. Now, given that this is a really bright scene that you're in, you could actually, instead of shooting at 800 here, you could shift your ISO to 3200. And let's think about what's going to happen when we do that. So when we shift our ISO to 3200, the first thing to note is that our scene is going to look obviously a lot brighter on our monitor because our ISO is showing us what it would look like if our middle gray was a couple stops brighter, right? But again, nothing's changing on your sensor when you do that though. There's nothing fundamentally changing. All that the ISO change is doing when you're shooting raw is just showing you the image a little bit brighter, but it's all just metadata. So nothing is changing. The only thing that's going to change here is when you decide, okay, this looks too bright. Let me stop down a couple stops. So instead of being exposed for 800 at a 5.6, let's say that you close down to an 11, right? Now, in you doing that, your your middle gray is going to come right down. So now you're happily exposed to a 11, right? For that 3200. Now the same could be, you could do the same thing with an ND. It would make no difference. I'm just doing aperture so I can use my nice sliding scale here that I worked so hard on. And so now that you've moved your middle gray back down to expose for your subject, what has happened? You have actually done something now. What you've done is you've made a physical change. Changing the ISO to 3200 was not really a physical change of the amount of light that your sensor was getting, but moving this has done that. Moving your iris has done that. So in you giving less light to your sensor, now your middle gray is closer to your noise floor. In this case, it is 2 stops closer, right? So now your noise floor is up here. Let's change my drawing here just to make this a little bit easier. Now your noise floor is over here, right? And I know that that looks close in this example. It's just an extreme example. But now that we've done that, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 stops in our highlights before our white clips. And because we've done that, now this cloud is no longer clipping. So again, you would only want to do this when you have things in your scene that are not in your noise floor, right? If you have a bunch of trees and stuff down here at T8 or 5.6 and you wouldn't want to boost to 3200, maybe you would only want to go to 1000, right? It's about making those decisions in an informed way based on what's in your scene. So this would help you out in this way. But let's look at if you were shooting a night scene now, right? So let's say you're shooting a dark scene in a kitchen or something, and you have a person and they are exposed for 800. I'm going to move this back. They're exposed for 800 at 5.6 again, right? And let's say that there is a burglar that's going to be coming into their house, and the burglar is in the background and you want it to be suspenseful, and you just want to be able to make out a shape in the background, but you don't want it to be noisy. Because again, on this particular example, we have a noise floor that's going to be at 3 stops under, right? So now your burglar's all in the noise. It doesn't look great. What do you do? So what you can do is you can decide to, I'm going to shoot it at 200 ISO, right? Now, in you shooting it at 200 ISO, it makes your image darker. So what do you do in response to that? What you do in response to that is in order to get your middle gray back to where it's going to need to be, because again, right now, you're looking at a darker image, your middle gray is maybe down here at like a 2.8 or whatever, hypothetically speaking. So let's say that you decide to open up your iris. Now your middle gray has shifted back up. This is no longer accurate. Your middle gray has shifted back up, right? Now you're properly exposed for your talent in the scene, and you could do the same thing by adding more light into your scene as well. You're properly exposed for your talent in the scene, and now 1, 2, 3, 4 stops under in the background, our mean burglar, he is going to now no longer be in the noise. And why is that? Because we've added more light to our sensor. Because we've added more light, now our noise floor has gone down proportional to the amount of light that we have added. And this is, in this way, it's almost like a chicken versus the egg thing. It's like, is the ISO making you change your exposure? Yeah, that's all that's happening, but there's nothing physically happening to your sensor other than what you do, right? And this is basically why earlier I mentioned the exposure triangle. We should change how we think about it in terms of shooting raw video, because your shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, that doesn't really apply in the same way when we're shooting raw. The ISO isn't really doing much of anything. It's almost like just changing the brightness on your monitor. But the response of that is that it changes how you expose the sensor to available light. And the available light is the actual thing that's causing the shift in your dynamic range. And it's not really shifting it much. It's almost like a misnomer. It's just changing how you expose the sensor, and that is letting you get the most out of your camera. Okay, here we are in Resolve. Similar setup to before. I have got the footage this time. It's from my Red, because I wanted to see if there was a difference between how B-RAW handled this ISO dynamic range process versus how my Red does. So right here in the orange, I've got my 800 ISO. Over here in the pink this time, I have got my 2000 ISO. And over here in the green, I've got 250 ISO. So let's go ahead and pop into the color tab and see how this is going to play out. Looking first at our 800 ISO, we can see, let's just go ahead and skip straight to the money. Let's just look at our noise, since that's what we're talking about today. So for 800 ISO, we've got our noise. It's there, it's present and accounted for. Again, it's mostly fine, but you know, it is there. Okay. Now looking at our 2000 ISO normal exposure real quick, just for a baseline. Certainly there, a little noisier. Let's go 300%. Okay, yeah, the noise is there. We can see it. Cool. So now let's look at our 100 ISO. Okay, normal exposure, 100 ISO. All right, great. So now let's see what happens as we start to overexpose. So here's 800 ISO pushed 3 stops and corrected. Like I mentioned before, I've got my exposure compensation there, which I can turn into a LUT and put onto my monitor or camera. So we're going to look at the noise here. And as expected, the noise, since we have effectively just exposed to the right, is much less prevalent in the image. So now we're just going to go ahead and take a look. Since we know that we're still good 3 stops over at 800 ISO, let's see how that 3 stops over plays out when we are at 125 ISO. So we're going to pop over to 3 stops over, and as you can see, well, something's happened. Or sorry, we're at 250 ISO. Now it's completely overexposed. So you don't have those 3 stops of range in the highlights at 250 ISO. Now let's see how this is going to play out as we go higher. Okay, so at ISO 800 plus 4,
that's when we're starting to clip these highlights here. Obviously not ideal. So let's see if we go to ISO 2000. Okay, yeah, as you can see, it's much better, much less clipping. And I'm just going to show you what that looks like as before the exposure comp. As we can see, much less clipping here. Going back to our 800, we got a lot more chopped off here than we do over here. Yeah, that's pretty good. Now let's see how we do underexposure. So we're going to start off looking at our 250 ISO. Let's see how it does at -4. So this is -4. The noise is still there. Obviously, it's very present. I shouldn't say still there. It's very present. And then if we were to look at 4 stops under at 800, this is 4 stops under, it's much noisier. So there's a noise at 250, 4 stops under. And there's a noise at 800, 4 stops over. Now let's see what the noise looks like at 2000. Even worse. Okay, so we can see that our noise floor has been lowered at 250 ISO. As a result, we have got much cleaner blacks compared to the same done at 800 and compared to the same done at 2000. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so keep in mind that all of this is not the same for every camera. Like with anything, test, test, test. So now, once you've tested your camera to see how its dynamic range performs, and you're able to confirm the manufacturer's exposure distribution chart or create your own chart in order to be able to have a quick reference on your phone when you're out shooting. What you can also do to make this information a lot easier to practically apply during shooting is you can create an exposure profile in your Sekonic light meter. I know that you can do this with the L85D that I have here, and I think that you can do it with other light meter types as well. So this has been a lot of information, and I just want to reinforce that none of this is going to make or break your work. I just find it kind of cool how there's always something more that you can learn about how your camera works, and I just wanted to share that with you guys. So definitely go out and test all of this stuff for yourself. It's really fun doing these camera tests and just getting a little bit into the nitty-gritty of how your specific stuff works. I feel like there's always something cool that you can learn about it. So thank you for sticking with me this long. I hope that maybe you've learned something or at least have been amused by it. Well, thank you. Peace.